Thank you for joining today's executive session where I discuss the American Rescue Plan, which included $167 billion for education overall and $122 billion specifically for K-12. I'm Doug Meskar, and you are now in session. So, emergency assistance for non-public schools. As I mentioned at the start, this was $2.75 billion under the CRRSA, which passed in December. Another $2.75 billion in the American Rescue Plan. Now, it's kind of interesting, right? There's a little bit of controversy over this. This was not in the House version of the American Rescue Plan. It got added in the Senate version. And if you read the stories, Chuck Schumer, majority leader of the Senate, Democrat from New York, actually had a big hand in getting these dollars back in or into the bill at all for the American Rescue Plan. It's essentially the same as the CRRSA. One sort of little difference here, right, is that there's no funding for the governors this time. So, when you think about the structure of this before, the Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools, EANS, came out of the governor's pot. Now there's just no governor's pot. It's just this money for non-public schools. So Chloe, if you click again, the formula for how these dollars get to states is a little bit different, a little bit more emphasis on a state's population, a school age or post-school age. So you can see that 5 to 24, and then some emphasis on Title I or low income. So Chloe, one more click here. Like the December EANS program, lots of acronyms, I know, but the December EANS and the CRRSA actually required non-public schools to apply to SEAs, which we know, SEAs, state education agencies. That's the same way it's going to happen now. And hopefully it'll be smoother as states sort of figure this out. But a lot of states are still figuring out how do they manage these applications, because many SEAs are not set up to handle the money in quite this way or the applications. Now, keep in mind, though, that these dollars are representing services that need to be provided. You can see here in the key provisions, it's not a direct grant to non-public schools. It's to arrange for the provision of services. And then there's also some limitations on using these funds for scholarship programs like ESAs. If you recall, in the CARES Act, some of the governors used their money to support scholarship granting organizations, education savings account like programs in their states. That is not allowed under EANS. So this money has shifted over time, right? But this is very similar to what happened or what passed in December with the CRRSA. Tom, anything to add here before we move on?
Yeah, real quick. I think what's interesting is, and you mentioned it, Doug, is that most SEAs they don't have in many cases a direct relationship and working relationship with private schools in their states. So they've quickly had to ramp up and create ways to work this grant. And it's a grant that really only lasts, it's less than a year and the grant's over, right? So states are scrambling to set this up, and at the same time knowing that this grant has a life of less than a year, that from beginning to end. But one thing I think that's interesting that people might be overlooking is that when we're talking about almost $3 billion, it is going to specific schools, non-public schools, but the allowable uses that the money can be used for reopening schools, continuing instruction, addressing learning loss, supporting educational technology, very similar to the use of funds in public schools. So there's a real opportunity to engage with non-public schools. If you haven't in the past, they're going to receive considerable amount of funds. And when you look at the allowable uses of those funds, I think that there's an opportunity to engage with an entity in education that maybe a lot of folks in the education space haven't done yet. So I would look at those opportunities to pursue.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks, Tom. All right, we're going to touch on higher ed here just for a minute. Under the American Rescue Plan, $40 billion, Chloe, if you click again. Very similar to the CRRSA in December. An even greater percentage has to go to public and private nonprofit institutions of higher education. Just 1% for for-profit institutions of higher education. These funds flow, you can see here, mostly on the basis of Pell Grant enrollment. So students who are receiving Pell Grants are typically lower income. So they're definitely have an emphasis here, sort of like the ESSER fund as well. There's money specifically being sent to minority serving institutions, which include historically Black colleges, universities, and Hispanic serving institutions. A lot of this is the same. It's just the percentages have been tweaked a little bit. Chloe, one more click. And very similar uses of funds. So, you know, a little bit different if you're a for-profit institution than nonprofit, but very similar what's happened in the past. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Happy to answer questions later if you have those on the higher ed fund. Chloe, if we can keep going. But there are some more provisions in the American Rescue Plan that we should be aware of, particularly for the K-12. So if we look at childcare, $40 billion, Chloe, one more click, for providers, for families, for childcare. So $15 billion for the Child Care and Development Block Grant, $24 billion for childcare stabilization grants for providers. So trying to keep the provider ecosystem, you know, from collapsing, which there's some concern that in many, particularly local jurisdictions, you know, these providers are struggling mightily. And then $1 billion for Head Start. Chloe, if you click again. Again, assistance to providers. There's payment of staff wages and specific uses of these funds. We were not going to spend a lot of time on that today. Chloe, one more click for me. One thing to note is that they expanded the provision of these funds to include providers, even if they weren't eligible or weren't receiving CCDBG money prior to the pandemic. So a big chunk of funding for childcare, which is important to note. And then Chloe, another click. Perhaps for some of you on this call, even more of importance is the broadband money. So if you remember in CRRSA, there was about $3 billion, but a lot of those dollars were focused on offsetting bills that individuals and families may be receiving for internet. This $7.2 billion, and you can see it laid out here, is actually, I think, going to be more impactful. And not just because it's a larger amount of funding, but it's also, you know, how can schools and libraries provide connected devices to students, teachers, and other library patrons for internet use, either at home or at other locations? So how do we get more devices in the hands of students and teachers and families? It defines what a connected device is. We don't need to go through that. It's a little bit obvious, but included here. The FCC is going to run this program and pay 100% of the cost for eligible equipment and services. So there's going to be some regulation. We have to watch this closely to see how the FCC is going to sort of put forward guidance and regulation on this. But they only have 60 days to get this sort of set up and running. 7.2 billion is not nearly enough to answer the broadband challenges out there, but it's a whole lot more money than we had before. And I think a little bit better design in terms of getting students, getting families, getting other folks connected to the internet and providing them the devices to connect as well, which has been a gap. Okay, Chloe, go to the next slide, if you will. So as I mentioned at the top, we can't forget that all of the stimulus money is happening in addition to normal federal programmatic appropriations. And so in this chart here, you can see the increases. So if we look at Title I, received a $227 million increase, which is nice. It's not a great amount. It's kind of like cost of living adjustment, if anything. The new total for Title I for fiscal year 2021, which ends September 30th of next year, is $16.537 billion. And so, you know, sometimes with federal appropriations, no bad news is good news. So we didn't have a government shutdown, and we actually didn't have any programs cut. And I would expect that these numbers are going to increase in future years. this is not a pejorative comment in any way, shape, or form, but generally Democrats like to spend more on education than Republicans. And so with Democratic control of Congress and the presidency, there is going to be upward pressure on spending more dollars on our normal federal education programs. And in fact, you already saw that in the American Rescue Plan, where they included an extra $3 billion for IDEA. So the new total for IDEA is actually closer to 15.9 or almost 16 billion if you add in those monies from the American Rescue Plan. So as we look at these, for example, President Biden has called for a tripling of Title I funding, which would take it to almost 50 billion per year. He's also talked about fully funding the 40% federal share of IDEA. I don't know if we'll reach those numbers, but I think upward, sort of progress, and not just incremental, but sizable increases in these programs is something we should be looking for, and will be very helpful too when we talk about the funding cliffs as these stimulus funds decline. Normal appropriations sort of picking up where some of those stimulus funds leave off. And so that's going to be an interesting sort of dynamic to see as we move forward. Okay, Chloe, click forward here for me. So as we talk about what's the big picture, some data I found again from Brookings, and this is dynamic, right? This was a snapshot in time from about a week ago. Overall, though, I think the data is more positive than we expected. So obviously, state by state, there's going to be, states that suffered more, states that suffered less. But when you look at sort of aggregate totals on the right-hand side, compared to the Great Recession of 2008-9, we're on the whole, right? Again, this is going to vary by district, by state. We're in better shape than I think a lot of people thought we would be. And we are in better shape relative to where we were after the Great Recession. So that's something to keep an eye on, particularly as the vaccine gets out there and we're starting to do more and more reopening. Now, at the bottom, though, I just want to touch on an important piece. And then, Tom, I'm going to ask you to jump in here. So the American Rescue Plan provided $350 billion for state and local governments. That's a big number. And there was no money in the CRRSA for state and local governments. There was $150 billion under the CARES Act. And that $150 billion under the CARES Act got an extension, right? And those funds are managed by Treasury, and those funds can be spent through the end of this year. So this $350 billion will be on top of that previous amount. And as you all know, education is the number one, sometimes the number two, largest expenditure by state and local governments. So all this money coming to SEAs and LEAs is really helpful. But if we're not sort of addressing some of the lost revenue that states and localities will be, suffering from because of the pandemic, then there could be state cuts, notwithstanding the maintenance of effort issues, right, that I addressed before. So this money is going to help stabilize state and local government spending, which is also going to help stabilize, the amount of state and local money going into education. So you have to sort of think about both of these things together. At the end of the day, we're going to, I think, be in much better shape than we were about a decade ago from the Great Recession. That doesn't mean that there aren't going to be very difficult circumstances in places. I don't want to underestimate that. But as you look at the national trends, we are in a different place. Tom, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Great slide and great information. Those of us that lived through the Great Recession, I was a state chief through this, and I broke out in a sweat when I saw this gold line and living through those years, right? And we see how quickly we rebounded from the economic downturn because of the pandemic. But it hasn't been nationwide. And I think this slide, demonstrates that some states are seeing record surpluses while other states are seeing considerable decline. And so that's going to have a lot of impact on how states choose to use these dollars. I got a question just a moment ago from Will Krebs with Project Lead the Way asking about the maintenance effort waiver. And states can request a maintenance of effort waiver, and how that plays out is going to impact how states use these dollars and their requirement for maintenance of effort. And we're going to do our best to track which states are even requesting waivers and help make that information available. But I want to put this in perspective, and I'll use my home state because I know these numbers well. But when you look at a state like Idaho that is seeing a $600 million surplus in 1 year with state revenue, in a state that has about a $3 billion a year budget, right? So it's a considerable amount. And on top of that, Idaho is going to receive another $450 million for education just from this last round of funding from the federal government. Idaho spends about $2 billion a year on K-12 education, and now you see another, just in this latest bill that was passed, another $450 million coming to the state. So obviously it creates tremendous opportunities, but also it can become very difficult to manage. I'll just give you one example. Back during the Great Recession, Idaho received their allotment of money from the feds. We had the school improvement grants. Idaho would receive about 1.4 million a year. All of a sudden it jumped to 10.7 million a year. And I had, that was that money that went to the bottom 5%. That's where it had to be spent and focused. We had so many schools come to us and say they just did not know how to spend this much money that fast effectively. And so I think that's going to be one of the challenges going forward with this just huge influx of funds, and spending it wisely and effectively. It's going to be a challenge for states and local districts. The next thing, I want to go to one more slide. I want to go back and revisit a slide we looked at just earlier. Chloe, if you could go to the next slide. Slide 10, I think it was. Yeah, perfect. I want to revisit this because I think it's important for us to see how, on the right-hand side, how these dollars are being made available and the obligation date. You're going to see states spend this money in this cadence. These dollars are going to be spent over a period of years, not necessarily immediately, and not all of it. And you are going to see states kind of pay attention to what their state revenues look like before they commit a large portion of these federal dollars, because they want to see if they're going to need to use some of those funds to help with ongoing expenses that the district or school may have. So I think it's important when the first round of funding came out a year ago, there's a real push to spend those monies quickly. Some of them had a December 2020 deadline. We see these deadlines, these obligation dates, and I think you're going to see this money spread out and the decisions spread out over a period of years. And lastly, Doug, and then I'll move on, the other dynamic that you have is that in the first round of funding that came out a year ago, most state legislatures were not in session. So the governors and state agencies had the authority to spend that money. Now that state legislatures are back in session, many of them are passing laws and putting themselves in that decision making on how those dollars will be spent. And so again, it's just going to add one more step in the decision making and approval process for how these dollars are spent. Just one more thing that's going to have to be managed.
Well said. Chloe, if we go back let's go to slide 28. I think, team, as we digest this, Doug came up with what we're seeing as kind of big implications, big insights, right? Our guess about where the market will move. Doug, do you want to run through these?
Yeah, I will definitely do that, Adam. 2 points before I run through these real quickly. Actually, the first point is related to the first one about states offsetting stimulus funding. The maintenance of effort, maintenance of equity in the American Rescue Plan is very specific and very specifically added. So when we talk about waivers that states may be applying for to get out from underneath these, I think the bar is going to be extremely high, because they saw what happened with the CARES Act when the CRRSA was some offsetting of state and local spending. by the amount that they're receiving by the federal spending. And that is not sort of regarded, very favorably by the folks in charge at the U.S. Department of Education. So I would not expect to see many waivers for maintenance of effort or equity. And maintenance of equity, by the way, just to touch on that briefly, is the idea that even if you're maintaining your spending, you can't shift that spending around from high poverty districts to low poverty districts. So they're trying to say, look, you got to maintain your spending, and you've got to maintain your spending in ways that protect the spending for in high poverty districts and on a high poverty student. So there's going to be some offsetting of prior funds, but the nuance here is the new funds cannot be offset. And I don't think the feds are going to give waivers for that, just to be perfectly frank. Like, it would have to be an extreme situation to allow waivers of maintenance of effort for American Rescue Plan dollars. Now, as we talked about before, just real quickly running through a couple of these other points, this money stabilizes district budgets. There are going to be some funding cliffs, but that increasing appropriations, spending that is likely to come is going to, I think, soften the landing of some of that funding cliff, or that loss of stimulus dollars. Another one I want to talk about, evidence-based programming. So for learning loss, for after school, for summer enrichment, the legislation calls for evidence-based programming. And that evidence-based ties back to the ESSA definition. So they're trying to create, some standards, trying to say, look, you just can't throw money, at the wall. Like, you've got to really look at what evidence of success there is for a particular program or intervention. Now, there's more detail to work out from the feds in terms of how exactly are they going to apply the ESSA evidence-based requirements to these dollars, but it's there. And then lastly, I'll say, we look at these dollars, learning loss is such a focus, but obviously there will continue to be significant spending on non-academic things like ventilation systems. Personal protective equipment will probably still be a major spending category. So some of these other spending categories to help keep schools open once they reopen for in-person instruction will continue to be, I think, a pretty significant amount of the spending. If you can actually, Chloe, I don't know if you want to go forward, or Adam, if you had anything on that prior slide, but just want to turn it back over to you for your thoughts on that prior slide.
I think we're okay, Clay, right here. So team, why don't we open up for questions? I think these are our big items here. And I see a lot of great questions, and I want to make sure that we cover those while we still have folks on. So Doug, I'm going to hit you rapid fire. All right. I think first question, maybe an easier one, is, do we know where the data is for states about the allocations reflected in the budgets? Like, is there a website that's aggregated that? Has the US DOE provided that yet?
The US DOE has not provided the top line numbers because what the US DOE has done in the past is they said, look, this is how much is going to go to a state. This is how much the 10% set aside will mean for the state. And this is how much, will go to the districts under the 90%. Now, I will tell you, that we have created, Strategos has created a funding spreadsheet in the past that estimates what we expect districts to receive from these dollars. And as the dust settles, this was just done last week. We're working on some of those estimates ourselves, but at present, there's no one single source of information. And in fact, Adam, some states have just within the last week or so put up the funding allocations from the CRRSA, the one before the American Rescue Plan. So if you're interested in a state and how much that state is pushing down to the local level, the 90% under CRRSA, I would say check the state website as a first place to go. But even that information is a little bit slow. So American Rescue Plan, we're a little ways, probably a week or so away from knowing these amounts by state and by district.
And then following on to that, we're looking at the SEA overhead. There's a 10% admin charge. Do they have to deploy those funds as well?
Well, okay, so let's talk about the SEA amounts. So SEAs hold on to 10%. SEAs can spend 0.5% on administrative costs, okay? And then they have to spend 5% on learning loss, 1% on summer school, and 1% on after school. So of the monies that SEAs get, they have those specific spending limitations on administration, summer school, after school, and then on learning loss. So the rest of the money is, SEA discretion for statewide activities that they think will best address, what's happening in their unique state.
And then kind of reflecting back to Tom's point earlier regarding maintenance of effort, Will asked a great question. Do you know of a place to track where states have submitted a waiver? And if so, I see your head shaking. I thought the answer was no, but at least ask the question.
No, not that I'm aware of. A lot of times, states will submit those and then the Department of Ed will post them after the fact, sometimes long after the fact. So this is going to be an interesting one to sort of keep track of, because I think we're not going to have a complete picture of all the states. But if you look back at the map and you look at the states where their state and local economies have suffered more, those are going to be the states that are going to be asking for waivers on maintenance of effort, right? Because they're going to have a harder time maintaining their level of spending given their economic situation. So if I had to sort of start with how do I filter out, and just focus on the states most likely, I mentioned a couple before: Texas, New York, some of these states where their economic situation is much worse are probably going to be first in line to try to get some relief.
Great. And I will say, team, the Q&A is open, so participants want to add any more. We have our last one in the Q&A right now is, to what degree and for how long can SEA sit on the ARP funds before allocating to districts? And similarly, to what degree can they add spending priorities and restrictions?
Yeah, good questions. And then Tom, I want you to jump in on the spending restrictions. So, SEAs have to get these monies down to the district level. Under CARES Act and under CRRSA, like, it was a long time when before SEAs actually had to push this money down locally. It's actually a great follow-up question that I'm going to make sure I'm not telling you the wrong length of time that the SEA has before they need to get these dollars locally. With the extended timeline, these dollars are available for obligation until 2024 for the American Rescue Plan. And given that the CRRSA funds aren't even fully down to districts yet, it's going to be a while for the American Rescue Plan. But I would not say like 6 months from now, probably a couple months from now. And then that ties into Tom's point about the role of the legislatures. They cannot say you can't spend money on X, Y, or Z. Like, a state can't sort of supersede what the federal law says, which is a very flexible use of these funds. What they can do, though, is put their kind of thumb on the scale and emphasize and say, hey, we want to see a plan. We want to see how you address X, Y, or Z and how you're allocating funds to address those things. So in a way, they might try to create some emphasis within the law, but they actually can't pass a law that says you can only spend the money on X and you can't spend the money on Y, Z, or any other purpose that's enumerated in federal law. So it's a kind of a delicate, like, persuasion more than, coercion, if you will. And Tom, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, perfect. I think let me just go one step below that. Well, first off, Doug, the states that they can't pass laws, but that doesn't mean they won't try, right? we all know that. But what you are seeing, and I think you will see a lot of, is state boards, even governor's offices, focusing on the fact that over the past year, at the local level and at the state level, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars have been spent on education. Millions of devices have been purchased. Connectivity has been paid for. Digital content, digital assessments, and what they are wanting from districts is, how did you use the funds that you already received? How are you going to capitalize on that investment going forward? We don't want to see devices, once school opens up, all of a sudden devices go in the closet until the next pandemic. How are you going to integrate these investments that have been made going forward and get them embedded into the regular learning environment? And they're requiring districts and schools to put together plans, involve community members, business leaders, So that's going to be part of this. The way the legislature is going to lean in is not only a plan on how you're going to spend the next round of funding, but how did you spend what you've already received, and how are you going to capitalize on those investments to answer the questions of learning loss, open up schools, keep them open, and accelerated learning. So real opportunities for some great conversations, and then to be part of the solution for districts and schools going forward.
Great. Firstly, let me thank everyone for joining. I think a key piece of this, as we see it, learning loss, SEL, mental health, and reopening schools will be mission critical and should be areas that you as your organization should be tracking. I think as we work through this with our clients, it's, the common question, how do we strategize around this? How do we plan for this? How do we ensure that our products and services align? And this is something we do regularly. And so if you're looking for additional support on your market intelligence, on your go-to-market strategy, policy and funding, where you sit now in a competitive landscape, right? Pre-COVID, you had maybe different competitors than you do now, product market fit and segmentation. These are services that we provide and Doug leads with. So consider us a resource for you. On behalf of Strategas and just all the partners, thank you for being here. Spending time with you as our clients and members of our network is absolutely mission critical for us. And thank you, Doug, for a fantastic overview. And thank you, Tom, for highly valuable feedback. So that'll be our executive session, and you know where to find us.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody, for joining.